you, Barbara. And joining us tonight, our public policy consultant, Amara Enyer, Matt Bessler, president of the Illinois Opportunity Project, and Sylvia Puente, executive director of the Latino Policy Forum. Hello and welcome, everybody.
Thank you for having us.
For families like the ones we just saw in Barbara's segment there, should cutting Medicaid for such families, Amara, should that be off the table?
Well, I think it's definitely some difficult questions that we're grappling with now. I agree with an analysis that says that we have to start looking at what's revenue. So how are we replacing what we're cutting? It's not enough to say that we're against the cuts, and budget cuts aren't enough, but how are we going to replace that in the state budget? And that's a question that hasn't been answered thus far.
But Matt, isn't it a function of government to protect the most vulnerable children like Hector?
Well, that's exactly right, Chris. And what we see here is that the leadership in Springfield has failed the citizens of Illinois because they went down to Springfield and they continue to pass, budgets that are broken, put down unfunded mandates, and put us in a position that we have to do this. Those stories are heartfelt. We understand that there's individuals in need, and they should be rising. They should be going out there and talking about how they've been wrong. But let's make sure that that is directed to the people that put them in this place, and that's the Springfield leadership over the last decade that has put them here, not Bruce Rauner.
Well, no one wants these budget cuts, but some of these situations, like that little boy Hector, that's literally a matter of life and death.
It's literally a matter of life and death, and I really fail to see how we can justify budget cuts under any circumstances that we know are going to put more children in the grave. I really think it's unconscionable, and while I agree that our legislature holds responsibility, I think our governor is the one that's actually doing the axe cutting at this point. And what's not being talked about, which is clearly an imperative at this point, is revenue. Where are resources going to come from? We can see through this crisis that a lot of these government cuts certainly are not frivolous. They're not wasteful. They really are life-saving. And how can we live with ourselves as a state knowing that a child like Hector may literally not survive?
And in terms of these cuts, some of them appear that they could backfire. In the case that we just saw, it looks like in-home care is far less expensive than putting a child like Hector in an institution. So are some of these cuts perhaps a little too dramatic?
They're very short-sighted. We're starting to see that obviously this is going to cost much more. We're starting to see this in other circumstances as well. An organization I know that deals with homeless youth is getting a cut, but that's going to impact their nearly $1 million federal match. So the repercussions of what we're doing we haven't even seen. And what's really disconcerting is if this is not being done in a planful and thoughtful way. We know that there are going to be unintended consequences, but we know what some of those consequences are, and we could be doing a better job of trying to avert them.
So Matt, in terms of balancing the picture here between cuts and, as you say, getting more revenue into the state, where do you see that battle heading?
Well, I think you're right about the repercussions, and what we saw is that throwing more money at the problem with the leadership that we currently have isn't the answer. We saw the largest tax increase in history, and they generated over $30 million, $1 billion in revenue. And where did that go? Did that go to help these services? Did that go to help these families? No, they turn around, they barely paid down their debt, and they turn around and want to ask the taxpayers for more. So I don't think that's the answer.
But Matt, this is a structural deficit that's been decades in the making, as you've just said. So I think that we're trying to solve a decades in the making problem in 1 year is also not very planful or very insightful.
That's exactly right. So when you look at Bruce Rauner, who has the courage to go do this, and this is where he's been on the job 3 months right now, and
courage
he's trying
to make sure that children get killed.
Courage to make leadership decisions that our Springfield leadership has failed to do for the last 10 years.
Amari's trying to jump in, please.
We have to, when we talk about the courage to make those decisions, I think we have to look at broadly what other decisions have been made. So the courage to give businesses a $100 million tax break. At the same time as cutting services to much needed programs in the community that do have long-term effects. So we will pay for this at the back end. And I think it's the popular thing in the heat of campaigning and making these promises about what we're willing to do, but without taking into account the long-term effect that this will have on communities and actually costing us more at all levels. I don't think that that's what we should be. I think we need to be more thoughtful about how we're making decisions about cuts that are being made.
And literally to cut some of these services from one day to the next, which is what happened with the Good Friday massacres. It's now being cut. Services for autism, no transition plan, no opportunity for closure, no opportunity for saying how are these children going to be properly cared for. And so while I agree, I think we would all agree that our state is in a fiscal crisis and that it is, to a large extent, our legislature that has gotten us here. Again, my point is that this has been decades in the making. It is not wasteful spending. It is a structural deficit where we don't have enough revenue come in. And the fact that we're making these kinds of painful cuts without talking about revenue options, to me, is really disconcerting.
Let's step back for a minute and look at the governor's first 100 days. When Governor Rauner took office, he said, quote, "I'm not going to be Mr. Popularity for a while." And it turns out he's exactly right. If we look at
he's popular with one
let's look at the
sector.
approval ratings here. So since taking office, his approval ratings have hovered right around 40%. They've actually come down a few percentage points in the last 2 months. Mara, how should we assess his first 100 days?
Well, it's hard to assess the first 100 days when we're looking at the long-term nature of the problems that we face. However, he has taken some very drastic measures that I think have jarred the state awake at all levels. But again, we have to look at what's been done. So on the one hand, we have the $26 million that's been cut that's affected some very important community-based programs. But on the other, we're seeing, for example, the salaries that are being paid for members of the people in the administration. And so is there a balance between what's being cut and who's feeling the hurt? And within the administration, what decisions is he making that really don't speak to the nature of everyone sharing in this pain?
And
Matt, we've seen the legislature and Rauner move quickly on some things. For example, they cleared the way for the Obama Library. But on these bigger issues, are we seeing progress yet?
Yeah, I think so. You know, the voters made a decision that they want a balance in power. And so that's why they brought Bruce Rauner in. And he's an individual that said that he was going to go down to Springfield and he was going to do what he had to do to change this state with substantive reforms. In other words, taking the making the tough decisions that had to be made that have been neglected for the last 10 years. So I think that when you look at what Bruce Rauner has done over the last 3 months in office, he has tried to put right to work, which is going to help increase local municipalities to have more decision making. And he's trying to do what he can to do true substantive reforms. And I think that's positive.
Sylvia, first 100 days?
Well, what I would say is what we've seen is it's really, to me, disconcerting when you see human service cuts, the Medicaid cuts that we're talking about, and we see tax credit investments for business. Pain is not being equally shared, and if we're going to feel the pain, then let's make sure that it's equally shared, and it's clearly not.
Here in Chicago, in the City Council, Governor Rauner has been taking some lumps for the right-to-work zones, but that's to be expected in the Chicago City Council. What is a little more unusual now is that we have seen mayors from many suburbs around Chicago meet with Governor Rauner this week, and they are howling about the proposed cuts to municipalities, which are going to be about 50% starting in July.
And I want to know where the evidence is, right? I mean, you know, he's talking about cutting our higher education system by 30% to root out inefficiencies and waste. He's talking about fewer resources to municipalities because they, quote unquote, need less money, and he feels that they're inefficient and ineffective. All well and good arguments, but where's the evidence and where's the data to support that, right? So, I mean, for me, the only sort of saving grace around this is that as dramatically as social services have been cut, we're seeing our municipalities being cut, we're seeing our universities being cut, so that really this, the pain is certainly being widely shared.
How about the municipalities, Matt? 50%, and apparently some of these mayors think these cuts are coming sooner rather than later.
Yeah, I think when you look at where's the evidence, you look at what the surrounding states that's happening with some of the policies that Bruce Rauner is trying to put in place. And he's trying to make Illinois more competitive, and he's trying to give local government, local communities more ability to be in charge of the issues that they face. And I think, you know, when you look at it, they have a decision to make. They can go join Bruce Rauner and blaze his trail of a true reform state, or they can stay with the status quo. We've seen what the status quo has done. We're in almost the bottom category, almost every single economic indicator out there, while the states around us are literally stealing our businesses and our citizens. So I think there's a choice for them to make, and I think that they've seen what they've had in the past, and Bruce Rauner is blazing a better trail.
Amara, if these municipalities are going to lose 50% of their income tax revenue, won't that inevitably lead to job cuts in those towns?
Well, the issue is that these municipalities are facing the same issues that are happening across the state, both at state government and, for example, in the city of Chicago. We're talking about a revenue problem. Even smaller municipalities are struggling with how to plug their budget shortfalls. And so now with additional revenue or additional funding that's being cut, they're even more in trouble, in my estimation, in determining how they will cover basic services, public safety, streets and sanitation, all of those things that municipalities have to deal with. And so it's really, unless we start talking about thinking outside the box in terms of how we will generate revenue at all levels, both at the state level and at the city level, we're going to continue to find ourselves in a situation where we're struggling with who to cut first. And one thing that I think that the governor's move has done is, if nothing else, it is forcing organizations and forcing cities to at least attempt to be more creative about how we generate revenue. I think that is a conversation that we need to have. And how do we evolve in light of the present reality?
And I think there just really isn't a balance. If we're going to cut this drastically, and we're seeing the pain that these kinds of cuts are causing across the entire state, I think we really have to get to the point where we're talking about what are our revenue options.
And the biggest revenue option that the governor is backing so far is a change in the tax structure that taxes services more than income. Matt, you want to fill us in on that?
Well, I think when you look at where we're at in this problem, and that is that I don't think that we have a revenue problem. I think we have a spending problem. And when you look at how
So the Medicaid piece we just saw is a spending problem?
Well, I think when you look at what
those services shouldn't be being
what a
provided?
decade of bad leadership is, that's the result. So we're trying to correct a wrong there. But I think when you look at
Correct the wrong of that child getting services
I think
and
you're
potentially
correcting the wrong. I
dying?
think what you're correcting is you're correcting a wrong of bad leadership in Springfield for getting us in this mess.
But
on the backs of
just to stick with the revenue question, though.
Sure.
So you're saying that it's entirely a problem that can be solved with cuts, and we don't need any additional revenue?
Well, I think what we've seen is that they've asked for more money, and we've continued to give them that money. They've asked for higher taxes. They're finding ways to tax us on multiple different places, whether it's generating revenue from red light cameras or sin taxes. In other words, they've been asking for money, they've been getting it. And what we found is that we continue to be in the last or almost dead last in every major economic indicator that we have out there. So I think when you look at, do they want more money? Yes, of course they do, but I don't think that's the right answer.
I don't think it's an either or. I think we can all say that, yes, there's much to be said about the quality of leadership over the last few decades, but I also think that there's a very real revenue problem and a priorities issue at all levels of government, particularly at the state level. And so we have to address both. Yes, we can have leadership that is ready to bring in and usher in reforms, but we also have to start thinking about how will the city and how will the state be sustainable, and that requires revenue. The reality is that in a lot of programs, we've seen cuts over decades. So funding has actually been consistently decreasing for many things. Those of us who've worked in nonprofits know that. And so we still find ourselves struggling with how do we generate revenue so that we're sustainable? And when we can do that, as well as have leadership that is quality and that is responsive to the needs of people, I think we can really move the needle in the right direction.
Let's move up to the city desk just for a moment. Police Superintendent McCarthy here in Chicago plans a listening tour to improve relations with the community, this following a not guilty verdict in the case of a police shooting, and of course what we've seen in Baltimore over the past week. Is this substance, this listening tour, or is this show? Amara, let's start.
I don't think it's substance. I think the listening tour is being used as a political tool. I think that after the last 4 years under this current superintendent, we pretty much know what the issues are. If you've been listening, if you've been on the ground, if you've been listening to conversations happening in the community, then we know many of the issues with trust between the police department and the community, with accountability, with the lack of transparency, and the lack of feeling that the police department will take police brutality cases, for example, and there will be prosecution and there will be transparency. I don't think that a listening tour is necessary. I think what we're looking for are tangible steps to address issues that have been vocalized over the last 4 years.
But Matt, is this a step in the right direction for Superintendent McCarthy?
Well, I agree. I mean, did this guy just show up on the scene here? He's not really sure what's happening in the communities. I mean, everybody knows that that the number one job of the mayor and the superintendent is to protect its citizens. And for the idea that he's now going to all of a sudden decide, oh, I'm not informed enough, I think that's ridiculous. I think this is a political show. I think this is a PR play, and I think that if he really was true to what he was brought here to do, and that is protect our citizens, he would have a clear understanding on how to do that.
Sylvia, the head of the Black Caucus in the City Council, said he welcomed the tour, but Alderman Beal, who represents the far south side community of Roseland, a very violent community, said that McCarthy hasn't returned his phone calls.
Yeah, well, I think that shows how much he's listening.
In terms of going out and engaging with the communities, we have seen this sort of tour. We saw it from Rahm Emanuel when he first ran for office, and we're seeing it in Iowa right now with Hillary Clinton. Is Superintendent taking a page out of the political playbook here?
Well, I think it has to be authentic. The listening tour should be taking place throughout throughout your tenure. So from day one, you should be on a listening tour. Part of your responsibility is to be on a listening tour. The fact that it comes out in times of crisis, I think, is problematic. Or when there's a need for some PR or positive PR, all of a sudden we're launching a listening tour. Perhaps if the listening had taken place consistently, there would be the level of responsiveness and implementation that can make sure that people feel that they're hearing what it is that we're saying.
And I think to the points that have been already made, we know well what's already wrong with this city. I'd be much happier if Superintendent McCarthy was on a tour where he's saying, here's what's going to change, here's what I'm proposing, give me your feedback, as opposed to let me learn by listening, right? I mean, we know what the challenges are. What's the plan to affect change?
But given what's been happening in Baltimore and North Charleston, South Carolina, and Ferguson, don't police chiefs like McCarthy have to take some proactive steps to show that they do want to listen?
I think it's fine to take those proactive steps, but again, I think it's why now, right? And again, he should be out in communities every single day. This should not be a novel new thing that the police chief of the third largest city in the nation is 4 years into his tenure on a listening tour.
One of the things that's driving this, according to McCarthy, is that he wants more cooperation from communities in solving crimes, which they have not been getting.
Well, the listening would actually help to build trust. And so when you're listening and implementing things based on what you hear, you're able to make some tangible changes that demonstrate to the public, to those communities, that they are being heard. That's the way to build trust. Once you can build trust in relationships, then you can get more cooperation from the community. But if they're feeling that they're talking to a brick wall, and the only time a listening tour occurs is when we see what happened in Baltimore, it's not authentic. And so I think those sorts of almost shallow plays just make the community feel that this is just something to do while it's a hot issue, and then it disappears once things die down.
And speaking of Baltimore, the Chicago White Sox played in Camden Yards yesterday. Remarkable scene of a baseball game going on without any crowd. First time in the history of the majors. Sylvia, why bother to play the game at all?
Yeah, well, America's greatest pastime, and there's no one there to watch it. I mean, I think it really is troubling. I think it's a really sad statement on what's happening in our nation today. And, you know, while certainly there's an economic impact for the city of Baltimore and all those vendors, it's really speaking to what do we have to do as a nation to make sure that we have peace in our communities, peace in our neighborhoods, and that we can stop the violence.
10 seconds, Matt, your last word.
Well, I'm a Sox fan, and so I was watching part of the game, and it was a surreal kind of setting on that, and I feel for all the people in Baltimore, and for the players that have to go through that, and the businesses that were affected.
And the lack of Baltimore fans did not help the White Sox.
Not at all. That's for sure.
They lost,
That's for sure. That's for sure.
8-2. So Amara Enya, Matt Bessler, and Sylvia Puente, thanks so much for your time
Thank
tonight.
you.